Among the cataracts of Atures, the travelers began to hear of the hairy man of the woods that carried off women, constructed huts, and sometimes ate human flesh. The Tamanakas called it Achi, and the Maypures, Vastiri, or Great Devil. The natives and the missionaries had no doubt of the existence of this man-shaped monkey, of which they entertained a singular dread. Father Gilly Gravely relates the history of a lady in the town of San Carlos in the Llanos of Venezuela, who much praised the gentle character and attentions of the man of the woods. She is said to have lived several years with one in great domestic harmony, and only requested some hunters to take her back, because she and her children, a little hairy also, were wary of living far from the church and the sacraments. The travelers did not see this mythical hairy man. They were horribly tormented in the day by mosquitoes and the gen, a small venomous fly, and at night by the zancudos. Their hands began to swell considerably, and this swelling increased daily till their arrival on the banks of the Temi. The means that were employed to escape from these little plagues were extraordinary. The good missionary Bernardo Zia, who passed his life tormented by mosquitoes and constructed near the church on a scaffolding of palm trees, a small apartment in which the travelers breathed more freely. To this they went up in the evening by means of a ladder, to dry their plants and write their journal. The missionary had observed that the insects abounded more particularly in the lowest strata of the atmosphere, which reaches from the ground to the height of 12 or 15 feet. At the Maypuras, the Indians quitted the village at night to go to sleep on the little islets in the midst of the cataracts. There they enjoyed some rest, the mosquitoes appearing to shun air loaded with vapors. The travelers found everywhere fewer in the middle of the river than near its banks. In the missions of the Orinoco, in the villages on the banks of the river, surrounded by immense forests, the plagues of mosquitoes afforded an inexhaustible subject of conversation. When two persons met in the morning, the first questions they addressed each other were, "How did you find the zancudos during the night? How are we today for the mosquitoes?" These questions reminded Humboldt of a Chinese form of politeness, which indicated that the ancient state of the country where it took birth. Salutations were formerly made in the Celestial Empire in the following words: "Have you been incommodated in the night by the serpents? How comfortable must people be in the moon?" said a Salive Indian to Father Guamila. "She looks so beautiful and so clear that she must be free from mosquitoes." These words which denoted the infancy of a people were remarkable. The satellite of the earth appears to all savage nations the abode of the blessed, the country of the abundance, the Esquizimach, who counts among his riches a plank or a trunk of a tree, thrown by the currents of a coast destitute of vegetation, sees in the moon's plains covered with forests. The Indian of the forests of the Orinoco beholds their open savannas, where the inhabitants are never stung by mosquitoes. At Mandavaca, The travelers found an old missionary who told them with an air of sadness that he had his 20 years of mosquitoes in America. He desired them to look at his legs, that they might be able to tell one day beyond the sea what the poor monks suffer in the forests of Cassiquari. Every sting leaving a small darkish brown point. His legs were so speckled that it was difficult to recognize the whiteness of his skin. Through the spots of coagulated blood, what appeared to the travelers singular was that the different species did not associate together, and at different hours of the day they were stung by distinct species. Every time that the scene changed, and to use the simple expression of the missionaries, other insects mounted guard. They had a few minutes, often a quarter of an hour of repose. The insects that dispersed did not have their places instantly supplied by their successors. From 6:30 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, the air was filled with mosquitoes. An hour before sunset, a species of small gnat took the place. Their presence scarcely lasted an hour and a half. They disappeared between 6 and 7 in the evening, or as they said there, after the angulus. After a few moments' repose, the travelers would be stung by zancudos, another species of gnat with very long legs. The zancudo, the proboscis of which contains a sharp pointed sucker, causes most of the acute pain and swelling that remained several weeks. Its hum resembled that of the European gnat, but was louder and prolonged. In the daytime, and even when laboring at the oar, the natives, in order to chase the insects, were continually giving one another smart slaps with the palm of the hand. They even struck themselves and their comrades mechanically during their sleep. Near Maypures, the travelers saw some young Indians seated in a circle, rubbing cruelly each other's backs with the bark of a tree dried at the fire. Indian women were occupied with a degree of patience of which the copper-colored race alone are capable in extracting by means of a sharp bone the little mass of coagulated blood that formed the center of every sting, and gave the skin a speckled appearance. One of the most barbarous nations of the Orinoco, that of the Ottomacs, was acquainted with the use of mosquito curtains, woven from the fibers of the morica palm tree. At Tiracote, on the coast of the Caracas, the copper-colored people slept buried in the sand. In the villages of the Rio Magdalena, the Indians often invited the travelers to stretch themselves on ox skins. Near the church, in the middle of the great square where they had assembled all the cows in the neighborhood, the proximity of cattle gives some repose to man. The Indians of the upper Orinoco and Cassiquari, seeing the bon plant could not prepare his herbal owing to the continual torment of the mosquitoes, invited him to enter their ovens. Thus they called the little chambers, without doors or windows, into which they crept horizontally through a very low opening, where they had driven away the insects by means of a fire and wet brushwood, which emanated a great deal of smoke. They closed the opening of the oven. The absence of the mosquitoes, which purchased dearly enough by the excessive heat of the stagnated air, and the smoke of a torch of copal, which lighted the oven during their stay in it. Bon Plant, with courage and patience well worthy of praise, dried hundreds of plants shut up in these ovens of the Indians. They embarked on the mission on the morning of the 17th of April. On the 18th, they stopped at the mouth of the Rio Tomo. The Indians went on shore to prepare their food and take some repose. When the travelers reached the foot of the cataract of the Guahibos, it was near 5 in the afternoon. It was extremely difficult to go up the current against a mass of water precipitated from a bank of gneiss several feet high. An Indian threw himself into the water to reach by swimming the rock that divided the cataract into two parts. A rope was fastened to the point of the rock, and when the canoe was hauled near enough, their instruments, their dry plants, and the provision they had collected at Turas were landed in the cataract itself. They remarked with surprise that the natural dam over which the river was precipitated presented a dry space of considerable extent, where they stopped to see the boat go up. The rock of gneiss exhibited circular holes, the largest of which were 4 feet deep and 18 inches wide. These funnels contained quartz pebbles and appeared to have been formed by the friction of masses rolled along by the impulses of the water. Their situation in the midst of the cataract was singular enough, but unattended by the smallest of danger. The missionary who accompanied them had his fever fit on him, in order to quench the thirst by which he was tormented. The idea suggested itself to them of preparing a refreshing beverage for him in one of the excavations of the rock. They had taken on board added to us an Indian basket filled with sugar, limes, and grenadillas. As they were destitute of large vessels for holding and mixing liquids, they poured the water of the river by means of a calabash into one of the holes of the rock, to which they added sugar and lime juice. In a few minutes they had an excellent beverage. After an hour of expectation, they saw their boat arrive at the cataract, and were soon ready to depart. They were now overtaken by a storm, accompanied happily by no wind, but the rain fell in torrents. After rowing a while, the pilot declared that, far from gaining upon the current, they were again approaching the cataract. These moments of uncertainty appeared to them very long. The Indians spoke only in whispers, as they always did when they thought their situation perilous. They redoubled their efforts, and the travelers at nightfall, without any incident, in the port of Maypures. The night was extremely dark, and it was 2 hours or more before they could reach the village. They were wet to the skin in proportion as the rain ceased. The zancudos reappeared with the voracity which tipulary insects always display immediately after a storm. Their fellow travelers were uncertain whether it would be best to stop in the port or proceed on their way on foot, in spite of the darkness of the night. Father Zia was determined to reach his home. He had been given directions for the construction of a large house of 2 stories, which was to be begun by the Indians of the mission. "You will there find," said he gravely, "the same conveniences as in the open air. I have neither a bench nor a table, but you will not suffer so much from the flies, which are less troublesome in the mission than on the banks of the missionary, who caused torches of corbel to be lighted." They walked at first over beds of rock which were bare and slippery, and then entered a thick grove of palm trees. They were twice obliged to pass a stream on trunks of trees hewn down. The torches had already ceased to give light, being formed on a strange principle. The woody substance which resembled the wick surrounding the resin, they emitted more smoke than light and were easily extinguished. The Indian pilot, who expressed himself with some facility to the Spanish, told the travelers of snakes and water serpents and tigers by which they might be attacked. Arriving during the night at Maypures, they were forcibly struck by the solitude of the place. The Indians were plunged in profound sleep, and nothing was heard but the cries of the nocturnal birds and the distinct sound of the cataract. In the calm of the night, amid the deep repose of nature, with the monotonous sound of a fall of water had in it something sad and solemn. They remained 3 days at Maypures. Humboldt and Bonpland were enraptured with the cataract of Maypures, and they often visited the little mountain of Manami to gaze upon it, forming a surface of 4 miles in length, and presented itself at once to the eye. Iron black masses of rock resembling ruins and battlemented towers rose frowning from the waters. Rocks and islands were adorned with the luxuriant vegetation of the tropical forest. A perpetual mist hovered over the palms, and the summits of the lofty palms pierced through the clouds of the spray and vapor, which the rays of the glowing evening sun were refracted in these humid exhalations. A magic optical effect began. Colored bows shone, vanished, and reappeared, and the ethereal image was swayed to and fro by the breath of the supportive breeze. During the long rainy season, the streaming waters brought down the islands of vegetable mold, and thus the naked rocks were studded with bright flower beds adorned with melastomas and droseros, and with small silver-leaved mimosas and ferns. The calm of the atmosphere and the tumultuous movement of the waters produced a contrast peculiar to the zone. Here no breath of wind ever agitated the foliage, no cloud veiled the splendor of the heaven. A great mass of light was diffused in the air, and on the earth strewn with plants with glossy leaves, and on the bed of the river which extended as far as the eye could reach. They spent 2 days and a half in the little village of Maypures, on the banks of the great upper cataract, and on the 21st of April embarked in the canoe they had obtained from the missionary of Caricana. It was much damaged by the shoals they had struck against and the carelessness of the Indians, but still greater dangers awaited it. It had to be dragged over land across an isthmus of 36,000 feet from the Rio Tuamini to the Rio Negro, to go up by the Cassiquare to the Orinoco, and to repass the 2 cataracts. They landed at the mouth of the Rio Vichada, or Vistada, to examine the plants of that part of the country. The scenery was very singular. The forest was thin, and an innumerable quantity of small rocks rose from the plain. These formed massy prisms, formed ruined pillars and solitary towers 15 or 20 feet high. Some were shaded by the trees of the forest, others had their summits crowned with palms. Passing the Cano Pirajavi on the east and then a small river on the west, they rested on the night of the 22nd the shore of the Orinoco at the mouth of the Zama. Notwithstanding the black waters of the Zama, they suffered greatly from insects. The night was beautiful without a breath the wind in the lower regions of the atmosphere, but towards 2 in the morning they saw thick clouds crossing the zenith rapidly from east to west. When declining towards the horizon, they traversed the great nebulae of Sagittarius and the ship. They appeared of a dark blue. The travelers left the mouth of the Zama at 5 in the morning of the 23rd. The river continued to be skirted on both sides by a thick forest. The mountains on the east seemed gradually to retire further back. They passed first the mouth of the Rio Matavini, and afterwards an inlet of a very singular form, a squared granitic rock that rose in the middle of the water. It was called by the missionaries the Little Castle. They passed the night on the right bank opposite of the mouth of the Rio Siucurviapu, near a rock near Aricagua. During the night, an innumerable quantity of bats issued from the clefts of the rock and hovered around their hammocks. On the 24th, a violent rain obliged them early to return to their boat. They departed at 2 o'clock after having lost some books which they could not find in the darkness of the night on the rock of the Aricagua. The river ran straight from south to north. Its banks were low and shaded on both sides by thick forests. They passed by the mouths of the Yucata and the Arapa and the Caranaveni. About 4 in the afternoon, they landed at the Indian plantations of the mission of San Fernando. The good people wished to detain them among them, but they continued to go up against the current, which ran at the rate of 5 feet per second. They entered the mouth of the Guayavera on a dark night, past the point where the Rio Atabapo joins the Guayavera, and arrived at the mission after midnight. They were lodged as usual at the convent, that is, in the house of the missionary, who, though much surprised at their unexpected visit, nevertheless received them with the greatest hospitality. During the night they had left almost unperceived the waters of the Orinoco, and at sunrise found themselves as if transported to a new country on the banks of a river, the name of which they had only scarcely ever heard pronounced, and which was to conduct them by the portage of Pininchin to the Rio Negro on the frontiers of Brazil.